Welcome to this video on customizing Proloquo2Go 4 for visual access. I'm David.
And I'm Jennifer. There are two main kinds of visual issues that people who use Proloquo2Go may need help with. One type of vision issue involves a problem with the eyes and the optic nerves themselves. This kind of problem means that the eye isn't able to take in information and send it to the brain as well as it should. This is usually due to some kind of physical issue with the eye or with the nerve that connects the eye to the visual center of the brain. We're most familiar with vision issues like this. When someone has glasses to help them see near or far things better, they have this kind of issue. This kind of visual issue is very consistent. If you're nearsighted, you always need your glasses to see to the other side of the room. If you're colorblind, you can never see certain colors. The other kind of vision issue happens in the visual center of the brain. Information gets from the eye to the brain correctly, but the brain has trouble interpreting the information correctly or consistently. These kinds of vision issues can be called cortical vision impairment, often called CVI, visual processing disorder, or sensory processing disorder. These processing issues lead to very inconsistent problems. One day, a person may be able to recognize people across the room and spot and pick up tiny items on the floor. The next day, the person may not be able to do the same things and may not seem to see anything at all. Visual processing issues vary greatly in severity and in how they affect what someone can see and understand. We can't get into more details about visual processing issues in this video. We recommend you work with an ophthalmologist and a teacher of the visually impaired to find out more about the visual needs of the person you're working with. However, we can tell you some ways to adjust how Proloquo2Go looks and works to try and accommodate different vision issues. The first thing we think of when addressing vision issues is size. It's usually easier to see things that are bigger. Of course, the bigger things are on the screen, the fewer of them we can see at one time, so there's a trade-off here as always. You can change the size of most things you see in Proloquo2Go. To make buttons in the grid bigger, you change to a smaller grid size, a grid size that shows fewer buttons per screen. You do this by tapping the gears for options and you go to Appearance and Default Grid Size. Right now, we're at 5 by 9. If I want these buttons to be bigger, I've got 4 by 8 or 3 by 8, which is actually good on the iPhone, or 3 by 6 as options for landscape. Selecting a grid size where the buttons are as square as possible also helps. In Proloquo2Go 4, we've designed grid sizes that are optimized for landscape, which is what you see here, or for portrait orientation. If you go into grid size, you'll see that the grid sizes that have n by n buttons, so for instance 5 by 5, if I change to this when I'm in landscape, the buttons are rectangular, there's a lot of wasted white space, and the symbols are perhaps smaller than they could be. This is an example of a layout that works really nicely for portrait orientation, but not so much for landscape. So one thing to do is select one that matches the orientation you're using. So all of the orientations where the number of rows and number of columns are equal are good for portrait, and most of the orientations where the number of rows and the number of columns are not equal are good for landscape. You can see that the size of the text automatically scales when you change the size of the grid. So for instance, here the size of the text is bigger than it was on 5 by 9. You can't change the button text to use a certain font size, but you can change how the text scales with the button size, and you can change the font that's used. So here's how you do that. I'm going to go to Options and Appearance. I'm going to go down to the Buttons section and Advanced Options, and there's a section here called Text Options. And you'll see by default that what is used for buttons in Proloquo2Go is Helvetica Bold 100%. 100% is the base size that we automatically scale the text to. This size is the size that we adjust as you change the size of the buttons. I can increase this by tapping this arrow here to 120%. So 20% larger than it would be by default. That's as large as I can get it on these particular buttons. And then if I change the grid size to a smaller grid size, you'll see the text is also bigger there in proportion to the button size. I'm going to go back to the font. You can see we've got Helvetica Bold and 120% here. We can change the font that we're using. Helvetica is a pretty good font to use. There are fonts that are definitely not good fonts to use, like a fancy font like this is really hard to see, so I wouldn't do that. And you can also choose a non-bold font. So if I have Helvetica here and I tap on the I, the info, here are different varieties of Helvetica I can choose. Helvetica Light is a little bit harder to see. I'm probably, if I'm worried about vision issues, I'm probably best sticking off with Helvetica Bold, but I can switch to some other variants. You can also change the size of the font and the typing view. The typing view in Proloquo2Go allows you to use the standard iOS keyboard, and you reach it by tapping this Views menu here, here, and then tapping Typing View. Here you have the iOS keyboard right in front of you. By default, the font is relatively small. If I tap here to get to Options, I'm still in Appearance, and very end of Appearance, I have text options for Typing View. And here I can set a particular font size. So I am going to set 54. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then I can change the font that's used. So I'm going to change this to Chalkboard and maybe make that a little bit bigger. So there I go. You can also change the size of these word prediction buttons, and when you do, the size of the font scales with the size of those buttons. Here's where you would change the size of the word prediction buttons. I would go here to Prediction, and here I've got button size, and I've got a few different button sizes that I can use. So I'm going to go back to typing, and we've also created a keyboard called Keeble that has many different supports for users with vision and fine motor challenges. Keeble can be used with any other app that supports the standard iOS keyboard. So it can be used with Proloquo2Go, Proloquo for Text, Pictello, or any other app on your system. Keeble is a separate app, so it is not included with Proloquo2Go. But let me show you what it looks like. If I tap this globe, that's how I switch between keyboards. Right now it's switching me between different languages. If I tap and hold, I get the whole list of keyboards. And let's just go to Keeble English and take a look at it. Note that Keeble has its own word prediction, so we may want to turn off Proloquo2Go's prediction. As you can see, it's a kind of confusing. You have two predictions. So I'm going to do that by going into Options for Proloquo2Go. We're already in prediction. I'm just going to turn off prediction. And now when I go back to the keyboard, I just have Keeble's prediction. What you're seeing here is just one of the configurations that you can create with Keeble. You can specify the colors of various groups of buttons separately. And here what we've done is we've created a high contrast theme for Keeble. So you've got the nice dark key colors and the yellow and red contrasting font colors. This is often good for folks with either visual impairment or cortical visual impairment, but you will need to consult with your teacher of the visually impaired or your ophthalmologist as to what colors work best for the person that you're working with. So let's get out of typing view and let's talk a bit about the message window. You can change the size of the message window.
I do it.
So now I have some things in the message window. And if I change the size of the message window, this will increase or decrease the sizes of the text and the symbols in the message window. So I go to Options and get back to Appearance. And here this first section is on message window. I go into message window size. Usually message window is normal, and you can vary it from very small, small, normal, large, and very large. You can make quite a bit of change, however, it is at the expense of the other elements on the screen. I can also change the font that's used in the message window, so I go into Advanced Options and Text Options, and again I can change the font to something else. I'm usually pretty well off with Helvetica, but I can change it to bold if I want to. But note that for the message window, like for the buttons, I'm not able to change to set to a specific font size, and I'm not even able to change relatively how big the font is compared to the symbols. Sometimes it can be useful to hide the symbols in the message window. This makes the message window visually simpler, which can be good for people with cortical vision impairment, and it also emphasizes the text, which can be very useful for literacy development. Additionally, in this case, the text gets larger because there's more space for the text. So I'm going to switch the message window size back to normal, and now I'm going to go to Advanced Options, and in Display, I'm going to say Text Only. And you can see that that text is nice and big. You can also change the size of the navigation and toolbars. This will make the icons in the toolbars easier to see and select, but as with the message window, it does take room from the other parts of the screen. So I come in here to Appearance, and I have toolbar size. I can set that by default it's small. I can set it to medium, large, or very large, but as you can see, that does take up a lot of space. So I'll set it back to small for now. So we've seen how to make things larger. Sometimes, especially for people with visual processing issues, it can be more important to make things higher contrast, or to use certain colors that are easier to process than others. We saw that with the Keeble keyboard that we showed you earlier. We can do this by changing the colors used for screen background, button borders and backgrounds, and for fonts. And David's going to show you how to do this.
To make it easier for people with vision issues to see the grid view, we often recommend setting the view background to a dark neutral color. This makes the buttons more visible. So I go to Options, I go back to the general level of appearance, and here in View I can go to Advanced Options and I can change the background color. So I might make it a lot darker, or like this, or even black, or I might go for a dark different color, whatever I feel that helps standing out, and that obviously also depends on the actual user. So I'll go for a dark gray for now. In combination with the background color change, it can help to increase the visual contrast if we can see more of the background between the buttons. To do this, we can increase the space between buttons. So I go to button spacing and I can increase the space all the way to very loose. And let's go for medium for now. We have structured the pages in crescendo to have words of the same word kind clustered together. When this is done consistently across the different pages of the vocabulary, it can help people to find where to look for words of a particular word kind. We can make the structure of the page more obvious in a couple of different ways. The first is to make the borders of the button wider, so more of their color shows. So I'm going back, and then I'm going to Buttons, and in the Advanced Options I can change the border width. So I could go all the way from hairline all the way up to very thick, which is what I'll use right now. We can also color code the background of the buttons. You can see on fringe pages that we already do this to help the user distinguish the fringe buttons from the template buttons. So for example, if I go into food, you see that the food, banana, cereal, they have a light yellowish color, whereas the other buttons, they are from the template, they have a white background. Let's look at another page, for example, Actions, and there we can see that the buttons that are part of this particular page and not part of the template, they have a light pink background. So what we can do next is we can go into our options again, and we can change the color coding of the buttons. We're currently coloring the background only of the fringe buttons, but we could also do it for all buttons, and you may see a quite subtle change. So before we make this change, let's look at something else. Let's look at color intensity. So I can go from bleached to light to pale to bright. Let's choose pale for now, and then I go back here and I can more easily see the difference between color coding of all buttons or just the fringe buttons. Let's look at another folder. Let's go back into food, and here we can also very clearly see that effect. Of course, if I do choose more intense color for the background, I may also want to look at the color I use for the font. And in that case, I would go into advanced options, text options, and I might take a look at what font color I want to use that contrasts more with the dark colored buttons. You can also reduce the visual complexity of a page by hiding buttons that are more advanced. So let's have a look at how that works. So I'm on my home page, and I might go into edit mode, and I might select some buttons that are more advanced. So I might select make here, for example, and I might select some, and I go down here and I go to visibility and I hide them, and that obviously reduces the visual complexity of the page. Just be sure not to hide too much vocabulary. You need to leave enough for the person to be able to communicate at their current level of language development, and for you to be able to model at a higher level of language development.
If you're working with someone who has really poor vision or no vision, but reasonable fine motor skills, you can try auditory fishing. This is an access method where you can run your finger along the screen, and Proloquo2Go will read the labels of the buttons as you touch them. When you hear the label of the button you want, you just lift up your finger and the button is selected. So let me show you how to set that up. I go into Options and Access Method, and what I want is Select on Release. So I turn that on and I go into Configuration. I have two modes I could be in. So let me tap here. I have first finger up, and with first finger up, I can touch the screen with as many fingers as I like. The app is going to track all of the fingers, but it's only going to pay attention to the first finger that I lift up. But that can be very confusing if I'm getting auditory information about all of those buttons that all 5 of my fingers are touching. So I can only use this auditory information when I select first finger down. So now that I've selected that, you can see that I can access the auditory cue, and I can change that to speak label. I will also have a visual cue. That will be a red frame, and I can change that color if I want to, and I can change the width of the frame. I'm going to change it to very thick because the borders of the buttons are very thick. The next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go to Speech and Language, and let me go into, press the I for information button here after English Australia, and then I can configure some things about the voices in my system. Right now, what I've got is a primary voice. This voice is the voice that's used for speaking out messages that I mean to communicate to other people. We also have secondary voice. This voice is currently set also to Olivia, but the reason behind having the secondary voice is it's useful to use a different voice for cues, for auditory cues, like you're going to get with auditory fishing, or that you might get with auditory scanning, or that you might get from previewing the grammar feature. So if I tap here, I can see that I can have Olivia be the secondary voice, or I can pick Rosie, say.
Hello,
so I'm going to pick
I'm
Rosie for my secondary
Wanna have a
voice. And the other thing I can do is here where it says relative volume, I can try and make Rosie a little softer so that people will be less confused that I am speaking things aloud without actually intending to speak them to the other person. I can also do things like change the speed of that secondary voice or change the pitch. But I'm just going to leave this as setting this to be softer. Okay, so I'll come back here, and now I can touch a finger on the screen.
Come, in, out, on, what, do, it, peep, chat, come, in.
And when I lift up, in is selected. Another thing that's interesting to note is this is called first finger down. And this method will also ignore other fingers that are touched on the screen after I press that first finger. Notice that if I select something that has a pop-up, like come, like a verb, whether or not the pop-up opens depends on how long your finger is on the button. You can configure the amount of time it takes to trigger the inflection pop-up here, or you can turn off inflection pop-ups altogether. So if I wanted to turn off the inflection pop-ups, I could come here and go to Interaction. And there's a couple of things I can do here. If I always want to open up the pop-ups, no matter what amount of time I'm in there, I can turn on Auto Open Pop-ups, and they're just going to open right up. Or I can come here to the secondary trigger, which right now is set to hold for half a second. That means I have to be in the button for half a second before I can get the pop-up to be triggered. I can change this number, or I can set secondary trigger to none. And when I set secondary trigger to none, you can see that those little filled in corners on these buttons have all become unfilled in because there is nothing that's going to happen when I touch and hold the button as opposed to if I just touch the button. So now I have
the
secondary trigger turned off, and so I'm just selecting, I'm just getting whatever is on the button itself. I'm not getting the grammar pop-up. Another feature that is really useful for people who, in addition to a vision impairment, have serious fine motor challenges, and that's auditory scanning. You can use the same secondary voice for the auditory scanning cue when you configure scanning in Proloquo2Go.
Do check out the resources on our website, including additional videos, the downloadable manual, PDF tutorials, and you'll also find links to our various Facebook groups.